Welcome to the Masai Mara podcast. We have with us Professor Joseph Ogutu. I'm sure, Joseph, that a lot of people may not know about you and what you do. Would you like to start off by giving us a bit of a backstory of who you are, what you do, and what you bring to our conversation today?
I am a statistician and a researcher at the University of Hohenheim in Stuttgart in South Germany. I have been doing research on wildlife in Masai Mara and the greater Serengeti Mara ecosystem for many years and continue to do so to date.
I first came across you some years ago. I think you published a number of papers looking at the trends of wildlife populations in and around the Mara as well as other places. Would you like to give us a bit of a flavour of what your own baseline is in the research you've been doing on wildlife populations?
Yeah, one of the research I've been doing in the Mara is to look at the changes in numbers of wildlife and the livestock based on aerial counts or aerial surveys which have been conducted by the government, mostly the Directorate of Resource Surveys and Remote Sensing, known as DSRS, and its predecessors, the Kenya Rangeland and Ecological Monitoring Unit, or CREMU, since 1977. But even before then, there were also aerial surveys which had been carried out by the Game Department in around 1961 and by individuals like Fraser Darling in 1958 and others again by the Game Department in 1974. So yeah, in aggregate, there have been a large number of such surveys carried out in that region, and I've been looking at these numbers from 1958 to date to see what they're telling us about how the wildlife and the livestock are doing, and then the reasons why we are seeing those trends.
So what is the news on that? I mean, I remember one paper I looked at some years ago had already identified something like a 70% drop in wildlife numbers, and more recently you've been quoted as being even more alarmist than that, giving us no more than another 10 years before it's all gone. What's the actual state of play on the ground?
Yeah, the actual situation is actually very bad. So when I say that, it is not me who's saying, it's really the data that is speaking. Right? And almost all the wildlife in the Mara, apart from elephants, are declining in a way that maybe is beyond extreme, actually. Many of the species there have declined by more than 70%, maybe between 80 and 90% on average. But elephants have increased in the same period. I think for obvious reason that they have been heavily guarded and protected. The rhinos have also increased from a very small number. I think they were around 17 at some point. And their numbers have continued to go up. But besides those two species, almost all, not almost all other wildlife species have declined. And some of them have been locally exterminated, like the wild dog, the roan antelope, which even a hill is named after it, the roan hill in the Mara. There's no roan left there at the moment. And others like the Patas monkey, even though this is not counted using the aerial surveys, are now very hard to see. Probably they are gone. The Baisa oryx, the Gerenuk, the Greater Kudu. One could continue naming them. The list is long. And there are some which are still there, but they're already facing serious threats, like the hartebeest, the Cox hartebeest, in that system. Now, besides just individual species, the key processes in the Mara, like the migration, about which many people are thrilled, is facing serious threat. And we know there are actually about 3 migrations in the Mara. The great migration that comes from the Serengeti to the Mara between July and October. The numbers of the animals involved there has not changed much, but the number of wildebeests coming to the Mara has reduced by nearly 58% if you compare the numbers now with what used to be counted when the monitoring began in 1977. And that small number that comes to the Mara spends 1.5 months less now in the Mara than they used to do. And the second migration is the northern migration, or the Mara Loita migration, that spends the wet season in the Loita plain to the northeast of the Mara, and then the dry season within the Mara itself, just like the Serengeti. That migration has collapsed. At its height around 1977, when counting began, the wildebeests involved there were nearly 150,000. And the gazelles, the Thompson's gazelle, were over 120,000, and the zebra were nearly 100. And now all that has collapsed, and that collapse took place mostly between 2015 and 2020. It's a complete collapse, mostly because of proliferation of fences there. And it is interesting because 2015, 2020 is at about the time when Kenya had just adopted this devolved government, so a lot of resources were going to the counties from the central government. One would have expected that these resources would help protect the species, but in this case, they actually accelerated the loss. The third migration is the one that spends the wet season mostly in Loliondo, to the northeast of Serengeti, and then they come to spend the dry season in the Mara. That migration is still there, mostly in Loliondo, but the numbers coming to the Mara is not very clear. It must have reduced because the place they enter the Mara to the southeast is mostly blocked, unless they come through Tanzania. So you can see both the numbers of wildlife and the key processes like migration, which are essential, have really been negatively affected. But before I finish, interestingly, livestock, which share the same space with wildlife, have not been similarly affected. So sheep and goats have increased very tremendously, and their numbers have gone up by over 270% since monitoring began. Cattle have gone down slightly, maybe by less than 10%. But interestingly, the number of these livestock which are using the Mara Reserve illegally has gone up by over 1,000%. So you can see, as conservancies are created, which give people money, and they implement controlled grazing, people then increasingly take their livestock to the reserve, which is a public property there. So beyond the Mara ecosystem, as we call it today, and the rest of Narok, like Transmara and Northern Narok, the loss is so great that it is between 90 and 95%, and most of the species have disappeared. So if the Mara is the best that Kenya could offer, and it contains 30% of wildlife in Kenya, at least by 2016, based on our analysis, you can see that this is really a dire situation.
Yes, a couple of thoughts occurred to me. I was in the Mara last November, and with guests who'd never been there before, and everybody was amazed just how many animals you can see in any one couple of hour game drive. So intuitively, your information is a little bit at odds with what a visitor might be perceiving, in the expectation that this is still a wonderful spectacle of wildlife. What you're saying, I think, is that it's nothing like as wonderful as it used to be. But is anybody listening to you? I mean, when you say dire straits, this is a disaster happening in front of our eyes. Is anybody taking any notice?
I hope that people are taking notice. At least I've talked with people that I could reach within the Kenyan system and the rest of the world, like we're doing today. What I would like to say, maybe those who are coming to the Mara for the first time will be greatly impressed by what they see, but what they see now is much less than what used to be there. I think there's this Dutch missionary who came there in 1960, Father Franz Moll, when he saw the wildlife there, he knelt down and prayed and said, God, now that I've seen your handiwork, I do not need to see any further evidence of existence. What he saw was enormous herds of wildlife there, like nothing like what you see today. And these numbers are based on actual count, so they are not like impressions that one could just have from one's mind. There are systematic counts which have been carried out the same way consistently throughout. And not only those original counts by the Directorate of Resource Surveys, even the Kenya Wildlife Service and the Wildlife and Research and Training Institute together have also conducted total counts there in 2021, and then again in 2024 they confirm the same patterns that we're seeing there. And we are talking of data spanning over 50 years now. So that's a long period. And if it is consistent, they're consistently going down. And the livestock, which is using the same area, is going up. So it is not climate change that is causing this loss. It is just the way the land is being used. And it's also the increase in human population. Because in Narok County now, we have like 1.2 million people or thereabout. When the last national census was done in 2019, and in the census of 1948, the whole Mara ecosystem had only 19,200 people, and the whole of Narok district had only 37,000 people. So you can see that human numbers have really increased, and with that increase, the increase in settlements, cultivation, and a lot of other developments have taken place there. They are taking the space for wildlife.
We're living in an era when politicians seem to ignore the findings and advice of scientists. Is that something you're finding frustrating?
Exactly. I think it is interesting question and also observation, because like the counts that have been carried out in the Mara, they are very expensive counts. Like one aerial survey there would cost something in the region of about $40,000 to $50,000 to carry out, and we are talking of many of them. And this is something financed by the government, so the government really deserves praise for carrying out this work for 50 years. Now, what is interesting is that despite this enormous work and the results of this work, they're not acting on those findings. Perhaps it could be useful if there was a way that this kind of results would trigger some action. Like you can say, if you see like 20% loss of wildlife, that automatically the relevant wildlife institutions in the country would act. So it is true, to answer your question directly, that politicians probably are preoccupied with so many other things that they do not have time or resources to devote to protecting or conserving wildlife.
Yeah, I think the politicians have different priorities, don't they? Their voters to come in human form rather than wildlife form. And even Narok County government prides itself on having a Masai Mara management plan, but from what you're saying, that's completely disconnected from the reality of what's happening in terms of conservation.
Yeah, there's a management plan, and I think a lot of work went into building the management plan. And besides the management plan, there's also the county spatial plan, which I think has a lot of good ideas. But there's a difference between having a good plan and actually implementing that plan. I think what is really lacking is the implementation. So I do not know whether it is because of competing social priorities that they don't have enough resources to implement this thing, or it's just that they just do not have interest to do this, because these changes are so dramatic and they are happening on a daily basis and we see them, yet nothing is being done. And what is surprising, some people would want us not to speak this kind of thing because they are uncomfortable truth. But I think if we are to be of true service to humanity and to science, and we really need to say what the data is saying.
Yeah, quite right. I think we'd all agree with that. And it's very important that we listen to rational, objective findings such as yours, and try and disseminate them much more widely. And you speak so reasonably that we ought to have a sense of alarm and be ringing bells and waving banners at this. It sounds that's important and that potentially that bad. I mean, from another perspective, government priorities are about creating employment, creating wealth, and exploiting the Masai Mara as a tourist attraction. This is one of Kenya's most important, if not the most important. But would you think then, from your findings, that the evidence would suggest it's being overexploited?
Yeah, I think first of all, it is important for the government to create jobs, to get money to support people, to develop. And the Mara is a crucial resource in that respect, because if you see a report from, I think as early as 1970s, they're saying the budget of the Narok County government now, and this predecessor, the Narok County Council, over 90% of it is actually coming from the Mara. That is as good as a resource could be. And it continues to increase. Now, what is really surprising is that despite this increase in the resource base that the Mara is generating, the conditions for the wildlife, that is the basis of this resource, continues to get worse over time. It is as if we continue to harvest the eggs and not caring about the goose that lays the golden eggs all the time. That is the problem.
Do you have any personal recommendations of what kind of actions ought to be in place as a matter of some emergency to halt this decline?
Yeah, I think we have identified a lot of things that one could do on an emergency basis, and we have written them down, some of them in a recent report on the wildlife census that was done in Kenya, actually just last year. The report just came out last year. But looking at the Mara specifically, you see that the plans for zoning the Mara so that development can be controlled and planned. You see the problems there. One is we are building roads, for example, like the road from Narok to Sekenani, the main gate to the Mara. It's an important road, but it also crosses places which are used by the migration and other wildlife, critical wildlife areas. One would have expected, at the very least, that there would be safe wildlife crossings on that road, but there's none. And more such roads are appearing in the system. Secondly, settlements are increasing as human numbers grow, which is expected, without a plan on how we can separate places where settlement density can continue to increase from areas that the wildlife can actually, and even the livestock can continue to use. Third, the shopping centers or urban centers are increasing. We have actually tracked how they have increased from around the 1960s, and now we have over 45 such shopping centers in the Mara ecosystem alone. And they're really growing up and expanding, and there's no plan to control them. Some of them are in critical wildlife areas within the ecosystem. So this needs to be taken into account. The other thing is the livestock numbers, as I said, sheep and goats are increasing. What is interesting is that when you ask the people what they feel about the numbers of livestock, they say they're having fewer animals now than they used to have in the past, which is true, but the number of households having this livestock has tremendously increased. So each household is having fewer now, on average, than the households used to have in the past. But if you multiply the number of households and the average per household, then you get this huge increase that you see there. And then the sheep and goats, they eat the grass before the wildebeest comes or before the other wildlife. So essentially, if they're displacing wildlife, and even cattle are not able to compete with them. Another big issue, a very big one, is the fences. When the land has been privatized and subdivided and individuated, and now fenced, and the fences are spreading like bushfire, the Mara. It is actually one reason why the migration of the Mara Loita collapsed, because they just got entangled in fences, they got blocked in fences. So these fences have become so many, and it is something people could be given incentives to remove them or to reduce their number. The other thing, of course, was the expansion of wheat fields and maize in the Loita plain, the wet season breeding ground, where the wildebeest was spending the wet season, the Mara Loita wildebeest. This took place early in the 70s with the encouragement of the government and the World Bank and the IMF and other organizations at that time. It was thought to be a great idea. So the other thing, of course, the creation of conservancies has bought some time for the migration and the wildlife in general. But the thing is that the conservancies and the reserve are all located in the dry season concentration area of the migration and not the wet season where they breed. So even if you protect excuse me, even if you protect the dry season area, the conservancies and the reserve, and you don't protect the wet season grazing area, then you cannot protect the migration. So some people believe that they're doing well in the conservancies because they have seen wildebeest numbers increasing in like the Mara North in the wet season, but they didn't realize that this increase is because the wildebeest were blocked. They could not go back to the Loita plains where they need to be to breed. And another thing, of course, is climate change. On top of all these human developments and activities, the climate is changing. Temperatures are increasing. In Narok, the minimum temperature used to average like about 8 degrees Celsius in 1960. And now it is like almost 13 degrees, an increase of over 5.3 degrees Celsius. The maximum temperature is increasing, which means the system is heating up and drying up and progressively. And lastly, also, within the reserve itself, where the wildlife is supposed to have a sanctuary, there's a lot of tourism development there. Tourism facilities have increased by 84% between 2012 and 2024. There used to be like about 95 facilities within the Mara system. By 2024, there were over 175, and they continue to increase. So there's a pressure from outside pushing wildlife and livestock into the reserve, and there's pressure from inside pushing them out. You can see that the wildlife are being squeezed in both directions, and increasingly they just don't have space.
Yeah, very rational again, but very alarming. From a tourist point of view, I'm just thinking that people would be tempted to say, well, we better come and see it while it's still there. But on the other hand, people might well say, well, let's keep away because the wildlife needs its space. How do we balance dilemmas like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the parks were created as wildlife sanctuaries, but they were also created for human enjoyment, that people should come and see the wildlife spectacle, and that should also contribute to paying the cost of managing these parks, because it's very expensive to conserve wildlife. So you need conservation finance, and you also need money to support communities that live around those areas, because they bear the cost of having wildlife on their land, and on also the various interactions that they have with wildlife, like losing their livestock or losing their grass. So you need resources to do this. So I would encourage tourists to continue coming in large numbers. What one could say is that there are parts of the Mara beyond the reserve where there's opportunities to develop more tourism facilities. Perhaps the management of Narok would consider creating incentives that would encourage investors in tourism to consider going to areas like the southeast in the Loita Hills or Loita Plains, or in the Loita Plains where the wildebeest used to breed. So I think this kind of thing would help increase the volume of tourism while also protecting the wildlife and their habitat.
Very grateful for your rational explanation of all of this, and I hope you'll be able to give me a link where people can find published information that you've been talking about, perhaps the recent wildlife census, because I'm sure people will be interested to see more detail. Perhaps as a final remark from my side, and invite you to comment, is I think conservation has to come first, because tourists are not going to come and see grass. They're not going to come and see trees. They want to come and see wildlife. And the Mara, together with the Serengeti, is still one of the last places in the world where wildlife counts as an incredible spectacle. So would you agree with me? I know it's a bit of a leading question, but conservation comes first before tourism. Should that be reflected in policy?
Yeah, I think exactly. We have said that, and also the revenue that is generated by tourism, perhaps a bigger percentage of it should be reinvested in supporting conservation. I think tourism is generating a lot of money, and it is good that it continues to grow. But the way that money is distributed and spent, I think that's where the question really lies. So how much of that money really goes back to support conservation and to support local communities who live with the wildlife there? So I think it is in the interest of the government and the interest of local communities to continue to grow tourism, to create jobs and resources. But they should at all times remember that this is supposed to support the conservation of wildlife and their habitat. And so that should come first. And that the money that is generated from tourism should not all just be redirected to other things and away from even where it is generated. If this balance can be struck, I think we can have both tourism and conservation in a sustainable way in the long term.
Yeah, it's a question of balance, isn't it, to get that sustainability. But I think if I hear you right, without wildlife, there is no tourism. And in 10 years, I think your latest paper has said there may be no wildlife to attract the tourists. So it's time to act, let me say, on your behalf. Would that be a fair summary of our conversation?
It is time to act, and I think the clock is ticking. And once you lose the wildlife, they don't come back again.
Well, Professor Ogutu, many thanks for your input. It may sound like bad news, but it's good to have a rational scientist, statistician, to be able to present this kind of information. I'm very grateful for you appearing on the podcast. So thank you very much, and definitely we'll need to keep in touch as time goes by.
Thank you very much.